A widowed farmer catches an elderly woman trying to save a calf stuck in the mud, but something about her catches his attention. Leave a comment telling me what you thought of this story, give it a rating from 0 to 10, and let me know what city you're watching from. I really want to know if you enjoyed my story, and I'd love to get to know you better. So subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on you. The sun had been punishing the plains for months without mercy when I spotted that figure in the middle of the mud hole. I was in the saddle on Thunder, my bay horse, riding along the cracked dirt shortcut that cut across the farm's boundary, a path I normally avoided since it passed near the old cistern where my father had spent his last days before he passed. That day, though, a wrong turn led me straight to it, and what I saw stopped my heart cold. A white-haired woman in a flower-print dress soaked through with mud was gripping a calf's head with trembling hands and screaming at the sky. She wasn't calling for help. She was fighting, with the mud, with gravity, with the weight of the animal slowly sinking. I sat there on my horse for seconds that felt like an eternity. There was something in that scene I couldn't quite make out. It wasn't just the strength of an old woman alone in a mud hole. It was the name she kept repeating as she pulled the animal. Patches, don't you go, Patches, stay with me, with an intimacy that only someone who had raised that creature could have. Patches was my calf, and I had never seen that woman in my life. I climbed down from Thunder with my heart pounding. The mud sucked at my boots with every step, but I didn't think twice. I got close to her and grabbed the calf from the side, pushing hard against the weight that seemed to want to drag it under. The woman looked at me with wide eyes, full of fear and exhaustion, but she didn't let go of the animal. Together, we pulled. The mud resisted, made a sucking sound, but slowly it began to give way. When we finally managed to drag Patches to firmer ground, the woman collapsed, sitting in the mud, wrapped her arms around the animal, and wept. I stood there, not knowing what to do with that scene, and unable to walk away. "How did you know his name?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but feeling the strangeness rise in my throat. She smiled with her eyes still full of tears and said simply, "Your father told me." The ground disappeared beneath my feet. My father, old Earl, had passed 3 years before after a long illness. No document, no neighbor, no memory had ever mentioned a woman named Dorothy. The farm had passed entirely to me without any complication, or at least that was what I had believed. But her words planted a seed of doubt that began to grow far too fast. I helped the woman to her feet. She was soaked in mud up to the waist, trembling, but steady. She said her name was Dorothy and that she lived nearby, in an abandoned house on the edge of my property. I knew that house, a weathered structure that had belonged decades ago to a family that had vanished without explanation. It had never crossed my mind that anyone was living there. "Do you need help?" I asked, still trying to understand what was happening. She shook her head. "I just needed to save Patches." And she began walking back toward the house, slowly, as if carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. I stood there, watching her disappear among the trees, with the calf snorting beside me and Thunder waiting patiently. In the days that followed, I tried to keep my distance. I had learned to distrust people after my brother-in-law Roy had tried to contest the farm's inheritance 2 years earlier. A dispute that dragged on for months and left me with a wound of betrayal that still ached. The arrival of a stranger who knew the calf's name and mentioned my father with such familiarity sounded to me like the beginning of something just like that. But Dorothy didn't ask for anything. She was simply there, repairing the fence of the abandoned house with her own hands, planting a bed of herbs, lighting a fire at the end of the afternoon. And every time the wind blew from her direction, I caught the smell of pinto beans, seasoned with leeks that my mother used to make, a smell that had not existed on those plains for 20 years. It was Clara, daughter of the owner of the town's general store, who brought the first concrete piece of information. She had a habit of keeping old letters that arrived for addresses that no longer existed. "Somebody has to keep the memory of things alive," she used to say, and she was the one who showed me a yellowed envelope addressed to Dorothy Baines, Meadowbrook Farm, Tennessee, signed by Earl, dated 15 years ago. I stared at that envelope as if I were looking at a ghost. My father had never mentioned a Dorothy, never spoken of letters, of promises, of anything that might explain why that woman was there now, living in an abandoned house on the edge of my land. "Can I read it?" I asked Clara, feeling my voice come out rough. She hesitated, but eventually agreed. The letter didn't say everything, but it said enough for me to understand that there was a history between my father and Dorothy that I had never been allowed to know. He spoke of gratitude, of a debt that could not be repaid with money, of a promise made in difficult times, and there was also a mention of a matter still unsettled, something Earl had promised and never fulfilled before he passed. I tucked the letter in my pocket and left the store with my head spinning. The plains were quiet that afternoon, but I felt a storm building inside me. I mounted Thunder and rode to Dorothy's house without thinking clearly about what I was going to say. When I arrived, she was in the yard, watering the plants with an old tin can. "You knew my father," I said, stepping down from the horse. It wasn't a question. She stopped, looked at me, and nodded slowly. "I did, many years ago. And what did he promise you?" Dorothy was silent for a long time. Then she set down the can, dried her hands on her dress, and invited me to sit on a wooden bench beneath a peach tree. I sat down beside her, feeling the weight of the moment. "Your father promised me a piece of land," she said, in that calm voice of someone who has already cried everything they had left to cry. "A place where I could grow old with dignity. That was a long time ago, when I cared for your mother in the last months of her life. I did it without charging a thing, without asking for anything, just out of love. Your father said he would never forget, and when the right moment came, he would give me that place." I felt the ground vanish beneath my feet. My mother had passed when I was 17. I remembered those last months, the pain, her frailness. But I didn't remember a Dorothy. "Why didn't you come before?" I asked. "I did," she answered. 3 months ago, I looked up Martin, your father's nephew, who handled all the estate documents. He told me the promise didn't exist, that it had never existed, and he had me sign some papers saying I agreed to that." Martin. My stomach turned. Martin was the man who had managed all of my father's estate documents. The man I had trusted blindly because he was family. The same man who, I was now beginning to realize, had presented the courthouse with a set of documents suspiciously complete and swift, as if he had already known in advance what he needed to erase. "What exactly did you sign?" I asked, feeling the fear rise. Dorothy lowered her head. "He said it was just a formality, that I was acknowledging I had no claim to the property. I believed him. I signed. Only afterward, when I consulted a lawyer in the next town over, did I find out that I had given up any right I might have had." I sat in silence, processing all of it. Dorothy's naivety had nearly cost her everything, and Martin, with his smooth talk and his papers, had taken advantage. "Do you still have a copy of those documents?" I asked. She nodded and went inside. She came back with an old folder stuffed with yellowed and stained papers. I took the documents and started reading. I didn't understand everything, but I could see that something was wrong. Dorothy's signature was clear, but there was a witness I didn't recognize, and the document had a date that didn't line up with the timeline Martin had presented to me. "I need help," I said, more to myself than to her. "Someone who understands this kind of thing." Dorothy watched me with those tired eyes, full of hope and fear at the same time. "I already gave up once," she said. I don't want to go through that again. I took a deep breath. I was not a man for confrontations. I had grown up learning to swallow pain, to work twice as hard when life pushed back, to not make noise. My greatest fear wasn't Martin. It was myself. It was the panic I felt when I needed to act decisively in situations of injustice. Years ago, when Roy had tried to take the farm, I had nearly given up out of sheer exhaustion. The scar from that was still alive in me, but there was something about Dorothy, the way she had waded into that mud hole without asking for help, without waiting for anyone, as if she knew that out on the plains you learn to save yourself before you wait for someone to show up. That woke in me a determination I thought I had buried alongside my father. "You're not giving up," I said, looking straight at her. "Not this time." I spent the entire night going through the papers Dorothy had given me. The oil lamp trembled on the kitchen table, casting long shadows on the walls of my old farmhouse. Every document I read seemed to open a new wound. It wasn't just her signature on that waiver. It was the way everything had been handled, too fast, too clean. As if Martin had rehearsed every step, even before my father had closed his eyes for the last time. When the sun came up, I already knew what I had to do. I saddled Thunder and rode to the next town over, where Sandra worked in a small legal aid office. The road was long, almost 3 hours on horseback, but I needed someone who understood all of this without charging me what I didn't have. Sandra was a woman of about 40, lean, with tired eyes from seeing so much injustice, and yet stubborn enough to keep fighting. When I explained the situation, she picked up the documents and began reading in silence. It took a while. She made notes. She frowned several times. "This is a setup," she said, tapping her finger on the paper. "The witness who signed alongside Dorothy is a man named Danny, a farmhand who used to do odd jobs around the area. I know him. If we can find him, I'm sure he'll confirm that he was pressured." "Where is he?" "Last I heard, he was lying low in a small town about 4 hours from here, afraid of getting tangled up in trouble." "Afraid of what?" Sandra looked at me with the expression of someone who knows things they'd rather not know. "Martin has friends, people who smooth things over for him when he needs it. Danny must have realized he'd signed something wrong and disappeared before trouble came. I left there with a heavy head. The idea of having to track down Danny, convince him to testify, face Martin, all of it made me feel small. But there was no other way. I mounted Thunder and started the journey to that little town. The sun beat hard on the plains, and the red dust rose with every step of the horse. I thought of Dorothy, alone in that house, expecting me to give up the way everyone had given up on her. I found Danny at the end of the afternoon, sitting in the doorway of an old roadside bar, drinking cheap whiskey. He was a man bent by work, hands full of calluses, a wary look in his eyes. When I mentioned Martin's name, he nearly stood up to leave. "I don't want any part of this," he said, turning away. "I didn't come to blame you," I said, sitting down beside him. "I came to ask for help. There's a woman who was deceived, and you're the only person who can prove it." Danny was quiet for a while, then he refilled his glass and drank it in one go. "Martin told me it was just signing, that it wouldn't cause any trouble. I needed the money, so I signed. Later, I found out I'd put my name on something I shouldn't have. I ran, and I don't want to go back there." "You don't need to go back," I pressed. "You just need to tell the truth, once, so that Dorothy gets what my father promised her." He looked at me with those deep eyes, full of fear and weariness. We talked until dark. I told him about my father, about the promise, about Dorothy in the mudhole saving patches. I don't know if it, but by the end of the night, Danny agreed. "I'll testify," he said. "Comes after me. You've got my back." I promised him I did, and I rode back home with my heart a little lighter, though still with a weight in my chest. I knew Martin wasn't going to take this lying down. When I arrived at the farm, it was already past midnight. The house was dark, but across the property I could see the faint glow of Dorothy's oil lamp still burning. I turned Thunder and headed over there. I knocked softly on the door. She opened it, startled, gripping a kitchen knife. "It's me, Eli," I said, raising my hands. She let out a breath, relieved, and invited me inside. The house was simple but clean. There was a smell of dried herbs in the air and a clay pot on the wood-burning stove. "I found the witness," I said. "Danny is going to testify. Sandra says that with his statement, we can get the waiver thrown out." Dorothy sat down slowly in a chair, as if her legs could no longer hold the weight of her body. Tears ran down her face, but this time they weren't tears of sorrow. Tears ran down her face, but this time, "Thank you," she whispered. I stayed there for a few minutes, not knowing what to say. Then I went back home, lay in the hammock, and stared at the ceiling. I thought about my father, the choices he made, the promises he left behind, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel anger toward him. I felt the desire to finish what he had started. Martin showed up at my farm 2 days later. He didn't wait to be invited. He arrived in a pickup truck, smiling, dressed in a light button-down shirt and clean boots, the kind of man who had never dirtied his hands with real mud. He stepped out of the truck carrying a leather briefcase. "Eli," he said, extending his hand, "we need to talk." I didn't shake his hand. I stood still, arms crossed, waiting. He pulled some papers from the briefcase and set them on the hood of the truck. "I heard you've been getting involved in this business with Dorothy," he said, with the tone of someone doing you a favor. "I came to save you time and money. I have a solution." "What solution?" "The land where she's staying is a protected conservation area," he said, pointing to a map. "I had it reclassified with the Environmental Agency. Any attempt at land regularization is going to take years, and it's going to cost a lot. A whole lot." I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. Martin knew the system. He knew exactly where to press to make the process drag on until people gave up. "But I have a proposal," he continued, smiling. "I'll pay Dorothy a compensation, a fair amount. She leaves, you two close this thing out, and everyone moves on with their lives." "She doesn't want money," I said, feeling my voice come out steadier than I expected. "She wants what my father promised." Martin laughed. Not a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a man who knows he holds all the cards. "Your father promised a lot of things, Eli. Not everything can be honored. You know that." He gathered his papers, slapped the hood of the truck, and got in. "Think it over," he said before closing the door. "This fight is going to break you. And her." I stood there watching the truck disappear down the dirt road, kicking up a red dust cloud. I felt the fear squeeze my chest, the doubt, the urge to quit and pretend none of this was happening. But then I remembered Dorothy's face when she found out Danny was going to testify. And I remembered the mud hole, Patches sinking, her fighting the mud without waiting for anyone to show up. I mounted Thunder and rode back to town. I needed to talk to Sandra. I needed a plan, because now I knew Martin wasn't going to back down, and the fight had only just begun. Sandra listened to everything in silence. Then she picked up the phone and made a few calls. When she hung up, there was a different look on her face. "I know someone who can help," she said. "Helen, a retired land surveyor. She did the topographic survey of your father's farm back in the 90s. If anyone has documents that can challenge this conservation area story, it's her." "Where does she live?" "About 12 miles from here. I'll call her right now." Helen picked up the same day. She was a gray-haired woman with thick glasses who lived in a house full of maps and old papers. When I explained the situation, she went straight to her files. "I remember that farm," she said, pulling out a thick folder. "I did the full survey, and I kept everything." She spread the documents out on the table. Maps, notes, calculations. And in the middle of it all, a handwritten note from my father, not legally binding on its own, but with undeniable moral weight. It described the area promised to Dorothy as land given in gratitude, not in trade. I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was hope. "Can I use this?" I asked. "You can," Helen said, handing over the documents. "And if you need me to testify, just say the word." I left there with the papers under my arm and my heart racing. The plains were growing dark, but I rode fast back home. I needed to show this to Dorothy. I needed her to know there was still a chance. When I arrived at her house, I knocked, and she opened the door with a worried look on her face. "I found it," I knocked, and she opened the door with a worried look on her face. "I found it," I said, holding up the documents. "I found what we needed." She took the papers, read my father's handwritten note, and broke down crying. This time, I didn't stand there frozen. I sat down beside her and let her cry, because sometimes that's what we need, someone who stays, someone who doesn't quit. The filing was submitted on a Thursday morning. Sandra put everything together, Danny's testimony, Helen's documents, my father's handwritten note, and even the old letter that Clara had kept. When we walked out of the courthouse, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. But I also felt fear, because now there was no going back. Martin didn't take long to react. The following day, he showed up at Dorothy's house, alone. I only found out when she came to my farm in the afternoon, pale and trembling. I was sitting outside fixing a fence when I saw her coming on foot, barefoot, her dress dusty. "He was there," she said, her voice coming out thin. I set down my hammer and went to her. "Who?" "Martin. He showed up this morning, alone, said I could still back out, that he had a better offer, money, good money, said it was so I wouldn't get myself mixed up in trouble, that I was too old to go through all this." I felt the anger rise hot and fast. "What did you tell him?" Dorothy took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and looked straight at me. "I told him your father didn't promise me money. He promised me dignity, and that this time I wasn't signing anything." I stood still, looking at her. There was a strength in those words I hadn't expected, a strength that made me realize Dorothy wasn't just a victim. She was someone who had learned over an entire lifetime of losses not to give in when something was right. "Did he leave after that?" I asked. She nodded, but her eyes were still frightened. "He did. But before he left, he said I'd regret it, that things were going to get hard." "They will," I said, being honest, "but we'll hold on." I walked Dorothy back to her house and stayed outside until dark on Thunder, keeping an eye on the road. I didn't trust that Martin had really gone, and I wasn't going to leave her alone that night. The days that followed were the longest of my life. The process started moving, but slowly. Every step seemed to take an eternity. Sandra called me every week with updates, but nothing was definitive, and all the while, the tension kept growing. Martin hired an outside attorney, a man known for burying cases in endless appeals. With every new filing he submitted, I felt the ground slip a little more. There was one night, I woke up in the middle of the night with my heart racing. I had dreamed I was back in that dispute with Roy years ago, when I had nearly lost everything because I didn't have the strength to keep going. I got up, lit the oil lamp, and sat on the porch, staring out at the dark plains. The fear was right there, alive, telling me to quit before it was too late. But then I remembered Dorothy saying she wasn't signing anything, and I got up. On the 10th day after the filing, Sandra called me urgently. When I arrived at her office, there was someone else there, a thin man with glasses who introduced himself as Charlie, an investigative journalist for a regional radio station. And I found it very interesting. Sat down slowly, processing that. "What do you mean?" "What do you mean?" Charlie opened a folder and spread old newspaper clippings on the table. In the past 10 years, at least 3 families lost land in similar situations. Documents that disappeared, witnesses who were pressured, promises that were never honored. Martin was always involved, but he was never prosecuted because the victims gave up before reaching the finish line. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why did they give up? Because he knows how to wear people down, Charlie said. He drags out the process, creates obstacles, offers compensation at just the right moment, and when the person is exhausted, he wins. But this time it's going to be different, Sandra cut in, because we have proof, and because you're not going to quit. I looked at her, then at Charlie, and nodded. I wasn't quitting, not this time. Charlie ran a story on the radio about the case. He didn't mention names directly, but described the situation in enough detail that everyone in the region knew exactly who he was talking about. The reaction was immediate. Some people reached out to offer support. Others to warn me I was messing with dangerous people. There was an old man who owned a roadside store who pulled me aside and said, "Eli, you know who you're up against, don't you? Martin has friends at the courthouse, at the county offices, on the police force. He's not going to let you win." "I know," I said, "but I can't quit now." He shook his head, worried, but didn't push further. The pressure mounted. Martin started spreading rumors that Dorothy was a con artist, that she was trying to steal land that wasn't hers. Some neighbors began giving me sideways looks. A few people stopped greeting me. I felt the isolation growing, closing in, suffocating me, but Dorothy held steady. Every afternoon I stopped by her house and found her working, tending her herb bed, patching the roof, cooking, as if none of it could drive her away, as if she had decided that whatever happened, she wasn't leaving. It was on one of those afternoons that she told me the rest of the story. We were sitting on the bench beneath the peach tree, watching the sun go down on the horizon. "Your mother was a remarkable woman," she said, looking at the sky. "In those last months, when the sickness had taken almost everything from her, she made me promise I would look after you and your father. She said you were both too proud to ask for help, but that you'd need it." I felt my throat tighten. "I don't remember you," I said, my voice coming out rough. "I know," she answered, smiling faintly. "You were very young, and I wasn't there long. But your mother made me swear, and I swore. And my father? Your father never forgot. He said that when the right moment came, he would give me a piece of land. Nothing big, just enough for me to have a place of my own. He wrote it in the letter, kept it with his papers. But when he died, Martin erased all of it." We sat in silence for a while. Then Dorothy stood up, went inside, and came back with a small wooden box. Inside was an old photograph, my father, my mother, and a young woman I didn't recognize at first glance. But when I looked closely, I saw the eyes. They were the same eyes as Dorothy's. "She gave me this photo," Dorothy said, "on the last day. She said that one day I was going to need to prove I had been here." I took the photo and felt something break inside me. Not anger, not grief. It was the painful understanding that there were parts of my family's story I had never known, and that perhaps my father had kept that promise in his heart until the very end, waiting for the right moment that never came. On the 17th day, Sandra called me with news that changed everything. "Danny gave his testimony," she said, her voice bright, "and he confirmed everything. He said Martin pressured him to sign that he didn't properly explain what it was, and that he paid him a small sum to go along with it without asking questions. With that testimony and Helen's documents, we have solid ground to void the waiver." I felt my heart leap. And the conservation area story? Helen managed to prove that the reclassification was based on falsified data. Martin manipulated the map. The judge has already been notified. For the first time in weeks, I felt real hope. Not victory, not yet. But it was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, we could pull this off. I told Dorothy that same day. She listened to everything in silence, her hands trembling slightly, her eyes shining. "Is it going to work out?" she asked. "I don't know," I answered, being honest, "but we're close." She nodded slowly, and then did something that caught me off guard. She took my hand and squeezed it hard. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up on me." I was lost for words. I just squeezed her hand back and stayed there, sitting beside her, watching the night fall over the plains. The next few days were ones of waiting. Sandra prepared the final defense. Charlie kept covering the case on the radio. And I, through all of it, kept running the farm, riding across the plains, trying to stay calm while fear and hope wrestled inside me. There was one morning I rode past the old cistern again. I stopped Thunder and stood there looking at that place. I thought about my father, about his final days, about the loneliness he carried to the end, and for the first time I didn't feel pain. I felt gratitude, because he had planted a seed of kindness that now, so many years later, I was trying to help grow. I mounted back up and rode to Dorothy's house. She was in the yard, planting flowers. "It's going to work out," I said, with a conviction I didn't know I had. She looked at me, smiled, and went back to turning the soil, and in that moment, I believed it. The 21st day arrived under a heavy sky of gray clouds. I woke up before sunrise with the feeling that something was about to change. Sandra had warned me the evening before that the judge would give his decision that morning. I saddled Thunder in the dark and rode to town, my heart beating out of rhythm in my chest. The courthouse was an old building with peeling walls that smelled of old paper and damp. Sandra was already there, along with Helen and Charlie. Dorothy arrived a few minutes later, having taken the bus from the next town, wearing the same flower print dress she had on the day I met her. When our eyes met, she smiled, a small smile, but one that carried everything we had been through together in those 3 weeks. Martin appeared with his attorney, a tall man in a dark suit who walked with the posture of someone who had never lost a case. Martin glanced at me, but said nothing. He simply sat down on the other side of the room, straightened his tie, and waited. The wait was silent. Long. Every minute felt like an hour. I looked at Dorothy and saw her hands clasped in her lap, fingers pressed tight together. I reached out my hand and held hers. She squeezed back without taking her eyes off the judge's chamber door. When we were finally called in, I felt my legs tremble. We entered a small room with a long table and old wooden chairs. The judge was a middle-aged man with graying hair and reading glasses hanging around his neck. He looked at us over the papers in silence and began to speak. "I have reviewed all documentation submitted by both parties," he said in a calm and firm voice. "The testimonies of witness Danny Briggs, the topographic documents provided by retired surveyor Helen Carter, the handwritten notes of the late Earl Harmon, and the challenge to the environmental reclassification." He paused long enough. I felt sweat run down my back. "The waiver signed by Ms. Dorothy Baines presents irremediable defects," he continued. "The witness testimony confirmed that there was coercion and that the signature was obtained through false information and undue pressure. Furthermore, the reclassification of the area as a permanent conservation zone was based on manipulated data, as evidenced by the original documents." I glanced at Martin. He was pale, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "Therefore," the judge concluded, "I declare null and void the waiver signed by Ms. Dorothy Baines and order the regularization of the land title for the area registered in the name of Dorothy Baines." in fulfillment of the expressed intent of the late Earl Harmon. I felt the world stop. Dorothy let out a long, trembling breath and covered her face with her hands. Sandra squeezed my shoulder. Helen smiled. Charlie wrote everything down in a small notebook. Martin stood up slowly, his face closed, and walked out of the room without looking at anyone. His attorney followed, carrying the leather briefcase. The door shut behind them, and all that was left was silence. We walked out of the courthouse in a slowness that felt unreal. The sun had finally broken through the clouds and was beating hard on the warm pavement. Dorothy stopped on the sidewalk, looked up at the sky, and breathed in deep, as if releasing a weight she had been carrying for years. "It's over," she said, more to herself than to me. "It's over," I repeated. Sandra said her goodbyes, heading off to file the last documents at the registry office. Helen waved and drove away in her old car. Charlie shook my hand, said he was going to broadcast the decision on the radio, and disappeared around the corner. And suddenly, it was just me and Dorothy, standing on the empty sidewalk, watching the town go on at its slow and steady pace. "Let's go home," I said. She nodded. I helped her up onto Thunder's back, something she had never done in her life, and we started the ride home. The plains were green after the last rains, the air smelling of wet earth and wildflowers. Dorothy held tight to my waist, and every so often I felt her sigh, as if she still couldn't quite believe any of it was real. When we reached the farm, the sun was already high. I stopped the horse in front of her house and helped her down. She stood still for a moment, looking at that old, weathered structure, at the herb bed she had planted, at the peach tree casting shade over the yard. "It's mine," she said, pressing her palm flat against the wall. For real, I confirmed. She went inside and came back minutes later with a bottle of cherry juice and 2 glasses. We sat on the bench beneath the peach tree, in silence, drinking slowly and listening to the birds sing. "Thank you," she said after a while, "for not giving up." "You didn't give up either," I said. "That's what made the difference." Dorothy smiled, that weary smile of someone who can finally rest. "Your father chose well in the son he raised." I was at a loss for words. I just looked at her, gave a slow nod, and finished my glass. In the days that followed, life began to return to normal. Martin left the area. I heard later that he was being investigated for other document fraud schemes, thanks to Charlie's story. Danny went back to working the land, more at ease, knowing he had done the right thing. Sandra called to say that other similar cases were being reviewed, inspired by Dorothy's victory. And I, through all of it, went back to the routine of the farm. But it wasn't the same routine as before. There was something different, a lightness I hadn't felt in years. Every afternoon when the wind blew from Dorothy's side, I caught the smell of pinto beans seasoned with leeks. And instead of hurting, that smell brought me peace. There was one day I rode past the old cistern again. I got down from Thunder and stood there, looking at that dark, still water. I thought about my father, the choices he made, the promises he left behind, and for the first time, I felt I had managed to finish something he had started. It wasn't about land. It wasn't about documents. It was about keeping your word, about doing what was right, even when the whole world pushed you in the opposite direction. I mounted back up and rode to Dorothy's house. She was in the yard, planting a young pitanga seedling I had brought over a few days back, from the old orchard on the farm, the same one my mother used to pick fruit from when I was a child. She was in the yard, planting a young pitanga seedling I had brought over a few days back, from the old orchard on the farm, the same one my mother used to pick fruit from when I was a child. "It's going to grow beautifully," she said, pressing the earth gently around the seedling. "It will," I agreed. We stayed there for a while, in silence, watching the afternoon fall slowly over the plains. Patches was grazing peacefully in the pasture nearby, fat and healthy. The crickets began to sing. The sky turned orange, then purple, then dark. Eli, Dorothy called, breaking the silence. Yeah? You changed, she said, looking at me. Since that day in the mud, you changed. I thought about that. Maybe she was right. Maybe I had changed. Or maybe I had just found a part of myself that had been buried for too long. That part that believed it was worth fighting, worth not giving up, worth holding someone's hand when the whole world let go. You changed too, I said. She smiled. We change when we find someone who doesn't give up on us. I stayed until the night closed in completely. Then I stepped away, mounted